learning about ecology, which is a fundamental aspect of biology, which includes chapters 43, 44, and 45. Now, one of the first things we have to know about ecology is in communities between species, the relationships that each species may create with another species. So, for example, between leafcutter ants and their nest, there's really like not a lot of interactions with a lot of other species. But when they harvest leaves, ants the ants will have to interact with more and more species. So, for example, flies, beetles, and fungi are all species that the ant will interact with. And when they interact with these species, they will develop relationships with them that can be positive, negative, or neutral. So there's many types of interactions. There's competition, which has negative effects on both species involved. There's consumer resource, predation, herbivory, and parasitism. Each of those are slightly different from each other. However, they all have a positive effect on one species and a negative effect on the other species. And another interaction is mutualism, where both species benefit, so there's a positive effect for both species. There's also commensalism, when there's a neutral effect for one species and a positive effect for another. And finally, amensalism, which is a negative effect on one species and a neutral effect on the other species. So, these interspecific interactions are usually like occur in all different types of ecosystems, and like examples of each, a consumer resource, when a leopard eats a deer, for instance, that would be a consumer resource. It's also similar to how like a rabbit might eat grass, and how a dog might eat like meat. So there's a positive effect on one species and a negative effect on the other species. So like the predator benefits, however the prey will suffer a negative effect, usually death. However, and so for competition is when two similar species compete with each other, and that has a negative effect on both, because both species will be will have less resources, and they'll both suffer. And for amensalism is usually accidental, and it's, for instance, when large animals such as a cow steps on grass. Commensalism and mutualism are usually they're like, for example, between like leafcutter ants and some fungi. Like the leafcutter ants can harvest the fungi as food, while the fungi will be able to spread their seeds to other places. Now, for the thing is that a lot of these interactions are an integral part of the environment. So like, for example, sea anemone and clownfish, they usually have a mutual relationship, where the sea anemone will usually have food from the clownfish's feces, while the clownfish will receive protection from predators. Now, this relationship benefits both species, and it's really an important part of the like sea ecosystem, because it ensures the survival of those species. Now, these interactions usually affect like populations and species distributions, because like the main reason for this is that when species, for example, when species positively influence each other, for example, mutualism, both of those species will have greater chances of survival. On the other hand, if there's more competition, then one of the species is less likely to survive. Therefore, that's an example of how these interactions can influence like population size and distributions of different species. Like for one example is between bacteria. Now, like when two bacterial species, P. caudatum and P. Burrasia, are alone, they'll each thrive in their respective environments. However, when P. caudatum and P. Burrasia are grown together, both of them will grow less because there's limited resources and they'll be unable to be as successful in their environments. So another example, this is slightly different, is P. aurelia with P. caudatum. When P. aurelia lives with P. caudatum, there's also competition, but the P. caudatum will go extinct. So that's an example of how species interactions will influence the survivability of certain species. Now, now we'll focus more on the distributions that are affected by interspecific interactions. Now, often, for example, in the intertidal zone, which is the area next to a beach, which has great diversity. Now, in some of those places, for example, there's stellate barnacles and rock barnacles that both live on the shore. Now, now basically these stellate barnacles will be more resistant to a certain. Well, they'll be more resistant to desiccation. So desiccation is basically this phenomenon that occurs in the interstitial zone, and basically it's related to species interactions. Now usually these species will be affected by the interstitial zone by desiccation. However, rock barnacles will kind of live in a different position than stellate barnacles because of this effect, where the interstitial zone, where they are more likely to be killed by desiccation. The next thing we'll talk about is a rarity advantage when species are coexisting. The rarity advantage is when a certain species is less likely to be preyed upon because they're less common. Now, when the species is less common in an ecosystem, they are the advantage they have from predators is that they will be able to occupy, for example, more hiding places. They will be less likely to find, and usually predators will instead look for a different prey. Now, another way that interspecific competition is reduced is resource partitioning. So resource partitioning is when two different species compete less because they seek different resources, and the intersection of the resources that they can use is usually will usually end up being what they compete for. However, the less of the resources that they share in common, the more likely they are to coexist. Now, however, this is different in intraspecific competition, which is competition between species of its own kind. In that case, since they seek the same resources, usually in that case, competition will be greater. Now, the next topic we'll talk about is how species are embedded into interaction webs. Now, some species are usually specialized in certain interspecific interactions, competing or consuming by other species. And so, in a food web, accurately demonstrates how a species will be is interwoven with all the other species. Now, in consumer resource interactions, that is usually what these food webs show us. So, in these food webs, the consumer resource interaction. So, for example, if we had the food web, then it would show like what each predator consumes and what each organism that is consumed by another organism. Now, here in this food web, then there are trophic levels. Trophic levels are the levels where there's like autotrophs at the bottom, which are the primary producers. They make their own food from the sun, and then the second level is consumers, primary consumers. These are like herbivores such as deer or cattle, and there are also secondary consumers which eat primary consumers, and tertiary consumers which eat secondary consumers, and so on. Decomposers break down dead organisms to use as energy, and they're not really on the trophic pyramid, but they're still an integral part of the ecosystem. So the next thing that we'll talk about is the cascading effect of ecological interactions. Now, conservational ecology is basically ecology that is focused at the conservation of ecosystems, and it's kind of similar to restoration ecology, which has its goal at restoring the primary the parts of the ecosystem. Now, oftentimes, for example, when you have a food web, if you remove one species, especially if it's a keystone species, which means it's a really important part of the web, then it will usually cause a problem, because its predators will have nothing to eat and will slowly die out, and its prey will overpopulate, which will be, after overpopulating, they will also consume too many of what they eat. So basically, if usually when an organism is removed, it's not good for the ecosystem. Now in Yellowstone Park, when they removed wolves for a certain amount of time, there was a trophic cascade, which meant that like the elk population overpopulated and causing them to overgraze on the grass, and so that wasn't good for the ecosystem. Now, another thing we'll talk about is invasive species. They will also cause a disruption in the ecosystem, because usually the invasive species we talk about are not part of the food web, and once they're introduced, they have no natural predators and will usually overconsume certain prey, and that's going to cause some real problems. And now, these invasive species, such as like zebra mussels, are usually very hard to control, and like right now, people have still been finding like methods to control or exterminate certain invasive species. Now, the next thing we'll talk about is interactions within species and how that connects to evolution. So, basically, we talked about resource partitioning a while before, and we'll talk about how interspecific competition, it can, because when like two species two species compete, usually if they want to coexist, then they have to survive in different niches. Now, a niche is essentially an organism or a species role in the ecosystem, and there is only one niche that a species can occupy. If two species occupy the same niche, then they will, one of them has to be eliminated from that niche. So either one of them has to die out, or they have to occupy a different niche, which is usually which is usually called the realized niche. While the fundamental niche is the niche that they would occupy if there were no competitors or other species interfering with with the species. Now, um, intraspecific competition can also increase carrying capacity. Now, the carrying capacity in a population is basically the maximum amount of organisms that can that any that a habit that an area can support while um, while there are no predators or interferences with the population. Now, when there's more interspecific competition, then usually there'll, there'll be patterns where the species will be able to increase the resources that they can consume, and it will basically increase the population for that species. Now, what we were saying about interspecific competition, that's it's the same idea that once two similar species that need the same resources are competing, usually one of them will open up and seek a different resource. Now, because of this, they will be able to coexist peacefully. Alright. Finally, the final thing that we'll talk about here is that mutualism is usually misunderstood, because mutualism is it doesn't make sense, because usually species will not evolve characteristics that will deliberately or intentionally benefit another species, but it's usually caused by evolution. And, yeah. Now that's the end of chapter 43. Now we will move on to chapter 44, where we will talk about ecological communities. Now, a community, as you probably know, is basically a group in an ecosystem a group of species in an ecosystem that occur in a geographical region. Now, basically these communities contain species that are consistently in that ecosystem. Now, now that you know what a community is, we'll talk about how communities change over time. So, basically, species composition will change as environment change. So, for example, when there's a disturbance in environment, then the species composition will change. So, for example, a disturbance could be anything from like a elephant dropping dung or a volcano erupting. Now, this change causes species composition to change, and for example, there will be when a volcano erupts, there will be like the area around the volcano will be all bare rock and ash, and at first there can be no animals that will be able to live in this environment. However, as more and more as like the pioneer species, which are the first species to habitat a disturbed area, a recently disturbed area, like for example like mosses and lichens that break down the rock, when they those pioneer species will first thrive in that environment because there's no competition. However, they will be replaced by by different species, such as shrubs, which will be replaced by trees, until it reaches the climax species, the climax, climax community. So basically, what I described here is an example of primary succession, which is succession from bare rock with no soil. Secondary succession is when a community or a ecosystem builds up from soil. Now that I've talked about succession, I'm going to talk about how this changes community composition over time. Now, when I was giving the example about the mosses and lichens, so the mosses and lichens, although they were first to colonize the area of bare rock, they cannot stay there for very long, because other species that will be able to use the soil will soon outcompete the mosses and lichens, and those will be outcompeted by the climax species, the climax community species. And so that's how a distribution of a community might change over time after a disturbance occurs. So the structure of these communities also affect how it functions. Now, a community functions usually is measured by the energy that goes through the system. So now, at an ecosystem, we can see how the producers receive energy from the sun, and they use it to grow, while consumers can consume the producers, and other consumers will consume those consumers, and decomposers will break those down, which shows how energy is cycled through an ecosystem. Now, when we look at this, when we look at energy, now we already talked about how energy will basically cycle through a energy pyramid where there's trophic levels, and in these trophic levels we can talk about the gross primary productivity. The gross primary productivity is the total amount of energy that primary producers capture and convert to chemical energy per unit of time. However, another way we can measure energy is the net primary productivity. So that is the amount of energy stored in a primary producer tissue per unit of time. So that basically takes out the energy that the primary producers use. Now, another way we can look at energy is biomass. Biomass is basically the total amount of energy in basically the dry mass of your tissues per unit of time. Now, one more thing we look at is the ecological efficiency of energy transfer, and this is basically how much energy the next trophic level obtains from the previous one. So usually we use the 10% rule from this. So that basically means that 10% of the energy that the upper trophic level obtains is from the total energy from the previous trophic level. And basically that means that if the autotrophs or producers in an ecosystem obtain like 10 kilojoules of energy, then the cattle that eat the autotrophs will gain only 1 kilogram of kilojoule of energy. So the next thing we'll talk about is how a community functions by species diversity. Now, we've already talked about niches, and we'll talk about how species diversity can be measured. Now, there's two ways to measure species diversity. One is by evenness, and one is by diversity. So basically, diversity is the total number of species in a ecosystem, while the evenness is how evenly distributed each of those species are. So basically, for a healthy ecosystem to occur, there needs to be high diversity and high evenness. Now, like an example of species evenness is if there's like five of each, each species has there's the same number of organisms in each species. And an example of diversity is just a large number of species, so like 100 species in like a small area. Now, next we will talk about how diversity patterns provide clues to what determines diversity. Now, species richness varies with latitude. So when we look at the world, we'll basically see that like usually when you think of tropical rainforest or like very high diversity, it occurs near the equator. And as the latitude increases, or the distance of the latitude increases from the equator. As you get farther away from the equator, then diversity decreases. So another thing we'll look at is how species richness varies in different places. So basically, species richness will basically vary when there's more distance from. Species richness also varies in different areas. For example, like distance from the equator, which is an essential part of diversity. Now we'll also talk about how community ecology shows us strategies for conserving a community's function. So there's ecosystem services. A short list of examples is given. For example, ecosystem services are the exchanges between the community and the abiotic environment. Now, we'll also talk about how island biogeography shows us ways to conserve diversity. Now, there's fragmentation, which is basically when the habitat is fragmented into different parts, and basically when this occurs, it's really detrimental to the environment because the species living in the fragmented sections are no longer able to interact with other species in other areas. And basically what this does is that this like cuts off some ecosystems that would otherwise thrive when they're interconnected with more places. And so this can be a problem, and if we avoid fragmentation, it will usually be it'll have substantially greater effects on the environment. So that summarizes chapter 44.